Fernley Hall, a place of secrets, where love and betrayal dance in the shadows, a life tragically cut short, and everyone is a suspect.
At Fernley Hall, a glittering costume party hides a deadly secret. When young Richard Fenwick is stabbed under the shadow of the ancient Astarte shrine, love and jealousy weave a tangled web. I'm Jane Marple, and in this house of masks, I'll unravel a murder where passion betrays, clues deceive, and truth lies in the heart's darkest corners. Chapter 1. The Invitation to Fernley Hollin. The quiet of her cottage in St. Mary Mead, Miss Jane Marple sat by the window, her nimble fingers guiding a pair of knitting needles through a skein of soft grey wool. The late afternoon sun cast a gentle glow over her garden, where roses nodded in the June breeze. On the table beside her rested a cup of tea, its steam curling upward, and a letter, freshly opened, its creamy paper bearing the crest of Fernley Hall. The letter was from Lady Sylvia Fenwick, a woman Miss Marple had known years ago in London, when Sylvia was still Mrs. Carstairs, vibrant and theatrical, before her marriage to the late Sir Henry Fenwick. The invitation was to a costume party at Fernley Hall, a grand estate in Devon, famed not only for its Elizabethan architecture, but for a curious shrine in its gardens dedicated to Astarte, the ancient goddess of love and war. Sylvia's handwriting was as florid as her personality, promising an evening of mystical enchantment, with guests dressed as figures from ancient myth. "Do come, dear Jane," she wrote. "Your quiet wisdom would be a balm amidst our revels." Yet, beneath the exuberance, Miss Marple detected a strain, a faint tremor in the loops of Sylvia's script. It was the sort of thing others might overlook, but Miss Marple, with her keen eye for the unspoken, sensed unease. She sipped her tea, considering. A party with its masks and motives was fertile ground for secrets. Her curiosity stirred. She penned a polite acceptance, packed her knitting bag, and arranged for her maid, Cherry, to mind the cottage. The journey to Devon was uneventful, and by dusk Miss Marple's train pulled into a small station where a chauffeured car awaited. The drive to Fernley Hall wound through lanes hedged with hawthorn, until the estate emerged, its stone façade softened by ivy. Torches flickered along the drive, casting shadows that danced like spectres. As Miss Marple stepped from the car, she adjusted her shawl, a practical garment unremarkable among the finery she anticipated, and surveyed the scene. Guests were arriving, their costumes a riot of colour. A man in a Roman toga, a woman draped as an Egyptian queen, another veiled as a priestess, her bangles chiming. The air buzzed with laughter, yet Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught fleeting glances, tightened smiles, the subtle language of those with something to hide. Lady Sylvia greeted her at the grand entrance, resplendent in a gown of crimson and gold, a diadem crowning her dark hair. "Jane, my dear," she exclaimed, clasping Miss Marple's hands. "You're a vision of serenity amidst our chaos." Her voice was warm, but her eyes darted, scanning the crowd as if seeking someone, or avoiding them. Sylvia led her into the hall, where chandeliers glittered above a throng of guests. She introduced her stepson, Richard Fenwick, a tall man with a painter's hands and a brooding air, his costume a simple Greek chiton that did little to mask his restlessness. Beside him stood Clara Vane, his fiancée, a young actress whose beauty shone even in her modest Athenian robes. Her smile was radiant, but Miss Marple noted a flicker of strain when Richard's hand brushed hers. Among the others were Dr. Maurice Haydock, a local physician whose charming manner seemed a touch too polished, and Mrs. Lavinia Price, a widow whose peacock-feathered headdress bobbed as she shared gossip with relish. Sylvia guided Miss Marple toward the gardens, where the shrined Astarte stood, a circle of weathered stones encircling a statue of the goddess, her stone eyes gazing implacably. Torches illuminated the scene, their flames swaying in the evening breeze. "Isn't it marvellous?" Sylvia murmured, her voice tinged with awe. Henry believed it held ancient power. Miss Marple nodded politely, her thoughts less on mysticism than on the living currents around her. Richard's curt nod to Dr. Haydock, Clara's quick glance at Sylvia, Mrs. Price's whispered aside to a stranger. As Sylvia described the evening's planned ritual, a theatrical homage to Astarte, Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the guests mingling near the shrine. A young man in a centurion's garb laughed too loudly. A woman in a sibyl's veil clutched her glass tightly. Small things, perhaps, but Miss Marple knew how small things could unravel great secrets. She recalled a village fete years ago, where a misplaced handkerchief had revealed a theft. Here, amidst costumes and shadows, she sensed a deeper drama brewing. Tucking her knitting into her bag, she resolved to watch closely, for Fernley Hall, like St. Mary Mead, was a stage where human nature played its timeless roles. Diku, Chapter 2. The Stab in the Dark. The night at Fernley Hall pulsed with an electric fervour, the costume party swelling to its crescendo as guests swirled through the gardens, their laughter mingling with the distant strains of a string quartet. The Einser air was thick with the scent of jasmine and the sharper tang of burning torches, which cast a flickering glow over the ancient shrine to Astarte. Miss Jane Marple, unobtrusive in her plain shawl among the garish costumes, stood near the edge of the stone circle, her knitting bag tucked under her arm. She observed the scene with the quiet acuity of one accustomed to seeing beyond the surface of village fetes and church bazaars. The shrine, with its weathered stones and central statue of the goddess, loomed under the torchlight, its carved features stern and enigmatic. Lady Sylvia Fenwick, resplendent as Astarte herself, had announced a mock ritual to honour the goddess, a theatrical flourish that had drawn the guests like moths to a flame. Sylvia stood at the centre of the circle, her crimson gown billowing as she raised her arms, her voice carrying a practised cadence. "Tonight we invoke the spirit of Astarte, goddess of love and war, to bless our revels," she declared, her words punctuated by the slow beat of a drum, manned by a servant in a hooded robe. The guests, some giggling, others caught in the spell of the moment, formed a loose ring around the shrine. Richard Fenwick, Sylvia's stepson, lingered near the statue, his chiton clinging to his lean frame, his expression one of detached amusement. Clara Vane, his fiancée, stood close, her Athenian robes shimmering, though Miss Marple noted the way her fingers twisted nervously at her side. Dr. Maurice Haydock, in a physician's tunic that seemed more theatrical than historical, watched Sylvia with a faint smile, while Mrs. Lavinia Price, her peacock feathers trembling, whispered excitedly to a young man dressed as a satyr. Miss Marple's eyes darted across the crowd, cataloguing details. The centurion, who swayed slightly, perhaps from too much wine. The sibyl whose veil slipped, revealing a tense jaw. The footman who hovered at the circle's edge, his gaze fixed on Clara. She had seen such gatherings before, in St. Mary Mead, where a summer dance or a charity ball could mask simmering rivalries. Here, the costumes and the shrine's mystique only heightened the sense of something amiss. Sylvia's ritual began, a blend of invented chants and dramatic gestures, the drumbeat growing insistent. Incense curled upward from a brazier, its smoke weaving through the torchlight. The guests caught in the spectacle swayed or murmured, some with reverence, others with barely concealed mirth. Then, without warning, the drum faltered. A sharp, piercing scream rent the air, slicing through the haze of incense and laughter. The torches seemed to dim, their flames guttering as if in response to some unseen force. Miss Marple's head snapped toward the sound, her heart steady despite the chaos erupting around her. Guests stumbled back, their costumes tangling as they pushed against one another. Sylvia froze, her arms still raised, her face draining of colour. At the base of Astarte's statue, Richard Fenwick slumped, his body crumpling against the stone. A dagger, its hilt gleaming in the flickering light, protruded from his chest, a dark stain spreading across his chiton. For a moment, silence gripped the circle, broken only by Clara's choked sob. Then pandemonium broke loose. Guests shrieked, some fleeing toward the house, others crowding forward, their voices a cacophony of shock and fear. Dr. Haydock pushed through the throng, his face grim as he knelt beside Richard. "Stand back," he barked, his hands probing the wound. Miss Marple, unnoticed in the melee, edged closer, her small frame slipping between the taller figures. She saw Haydock's fingers pause, then withdraw, his expression tightening. "He's dead," he announced, his voice carrying a clinical finality that silenced the nearest onlookers. Clara collapsed to her knees, her hands clutching Richard's arm, her sobs rising into a wail. "No, no, it can't be," she cried, her face buried in her hands. Sylvia staggered forward, her diadem askew, her eyes wide with horror. "Richard!" she gasped, clutching the statue for support. Mrs. Price, her feathers quivering, clutched the satyr's arm, whispering, "Murder! It's murder!" The word rippled through the crowd, igniting fresh panic. Miss Marple, her lips pursed, noted the reactions. Clara's uncontrolled grief, Sylvia's stunned immobility, Haydock's swift shift to authority, and Mrs. Price's almost eager horror. She also saw the footman, now retreating into the shadows, his face pale but composed. A burly man in a toga, revealed to be the estate's butler, shouted for order, directing servants to herd guests toward the house. "The police must be called," he bellowed, his voice cutting through the din. Miss Marple remained near the shrine, her eyes scanning the ground, the stones, the statue's base. The dagger, she noted, was ornate, its hilt encrusted with what looked like paste jewels. A prop, perhaps, from Sylvia's collections of theatrical oddities. The blood, stark against Richard's white chiton, suggested a single, precise strike. She glanced at the surrounding darkness, where the garden's hedges loomed, offering ample cover for a swift escape. Within the hour, Inspector Craddock arrived, his arrival heralded by the crunch of gravel under police tires. A lean man with a methodical air, Craddock was known to Miss Marple from a prior case in St. Mary Mead, where her insights had proven invaluable. He surveyed the scene with a frown, his notebook already open. "Miss Marple," he said, spotting her among the stragglers, "I might have guessed you'd be here." His tone held a mix of respect and wry amusement. "Any thoughts?" Miss Marple inclined her head, her expression mild. "Only that this shrine, with its shadows and theatrics, is a most convenient stage for murder," she said softly. The darkness, the costumes, the ritual, all designed to confuse." Craddock nodded, his pencil poised. "Convenient indeed. No witnesses, or so they claim." He turned to his men, ordering a cordon around the shrine and a search for evidence. Craddock began questioning the guests who had been gathered in the drawing-room, their costumes now looking garish in the electric light. Sylvia, seated on a divan, clutched a glass of brandy, her face ashen. "I don't understand," she murmured. "Who would do this to Richard?" Clara, wrapped in a shawl, wept quietly, attended by a maid. Haydock, standing by the fireplace, offered clipped answers, confirming the time of death, moments before the scream, and the dagger's lethal precision. Mrs. Price, her voice trembling with excitement, recounted the ritual's climax, insisting she'd seen nothing but shadows. The other guests, a mix of local gentry and Sylvia's theatrical friends, echoed her confusion, their accounts muddled by wine and fear. Miss Marple, seated in a corner with her knitting, listened intently. She noted the inconsistencies. 1. Guest claimed the drum stopped before the scream, another after. A woman in a priestess costume swore she'd seen a figure slip behind the statue, but couldn't describe them. Craddock, frustrated, confided to Miss Marple that the dagger, wiped clean of fingerprints, offered no immediate clues. "It's one of Sylvia's props," he said. "Anyone could have taken it from the hall." Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking. "A prop, yet deadly," she mused, "and the darkness, how it hides the truth." She recalled a village incident years ago, where a stolen brooch was found in a hedge, overlooked by all but the sharp-eyed postmistress. Here, the shrine's isolation and the ritual's chaos created a similar veil. She suggested Craddock examine the guests' costumes for bloodstains, a task he assigned to a constable. She also pointed out the footman, whose swift retreat had caught her eye. "Young men," she said, "often see more than they admit, especially when they're fond of someone." Craddock, catching her meaning, promised to question him. As the night wore on, the guests were permitted to retire, though none could leave the estate. Miss Marple lingered in the drawing-room, her mind tracing the evening's events. Richard's death, she sensed, was no random act. The dagger's precision suggested intent, the shrine's setting a deliberate choice. She thought of Clara's grief, so raw yet oddly theatrical. Sylvia's shock, tinged with something like guilt. Haydock's calm, too smooth for a man who'd just pronounced a friend dead. Mrs. Price's gossip, though tiresome, might hold a kernel of truth. And the footman, his glance at Clara had been more than casual. Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to Astarte, the goddess whose statue had witnessed the crime. Love and war, Sylvia had said. In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had seen both drive people to desperate acts. A jilted lover's spite, a rival's rage. Here, amidst Fernley Hall's grandeur, the motives would be no different, only cloaked in finer garb. She tucked her knitting away, her eyes bright with purpose. The stab in the dark had torn a veil, and she would follow its threads, however tangled, to the truth. Chapter 3. The Shadow of Astarte. The morning after the murder at Fernley Hall dawned grey and heavy, the Devon sky cloaked in clouds that pressed low over the estate. Miss Jane Marple, awake early despite the late night, sat in her guest room, her knitting needles moving with their familiar rhythm. The events of the costume party replayed in her mind, each detail sharp and distinct, like the pieces of a jigsaw puzzle scattered across a village hall table. The scream, the flickering, torches, Richard Fenwick's body slumped against the Astarte statue, all pointed to a crime both calculated and audacious. She set her knitting aside, adjusted her spectacles, and prepared to face the day, knowing that the truth often revealed itself in the quiet moments after chaos. Downstairs, the atmosphere in Fernley Hall was one of strained civility. Guests still, confined to the estate by Inspector Craddock's orders, gathered in the dining room, their costumes replaced by subdued morning attire. Lady Sylvia Fenwick, pale and hollow-eyed, presided over the breakfast table, her hands trembling as she poured tea. Clara Vane, Richard's fiancée, sat apart, her face drawn, picking at a piece of toast. Dr. Maurice Haydock, immaculate in a tweed suit, conversed quietly with a nervous young man in spectacles, while Mrs. Lavinia Price, her voice a touch too bright, regaled a reluctant couple with tales of local hauntings. Miss Marple, entering unobtrusively, took a seat near the window, her presence barely noticed amid the tension. Sylvia, catching sight of her, rose and approached. "Jane, you must think us cursed," she said, her voice low. "First Henry's death, now Richard's. This shrine, it's as if Astarte herself demands sacrifice." Her eyes, rimmed with fatigue, held a plea for reassurance. Miss Marple, ever practical, patted her hand. "My dear, stones and statues have no power, only people do, and people, I find, are rarely as mysterious as they seem." Sylvia managed a faint smile, but her gaze drifted to the garden where the shrine stood, cordoned off by police tape. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes roaming the room. Clara's isolation intrigued her. The girl's grief seemed genuine, yet there was a studied quality to her posture, as if she were aware of being watched. Haydock's easy charm, unbroken by the tragedy, suggested a man accustomed to masking his thoughts. Mrs. Price's chatter, though tiresome, might yield useful scraps of information. And then there was the footman, Tom, whom Miss Marple had noticed the previous night. He moved silently among the guests, refilling coffee, his expression guarded. She recalled a village lad in St. Mary Mead, whose furtive glances had betrayed a theft. Tom's demeanour hinted at knowledge he was reluctant to share. After breakfast, Miss Marple slipped away to the library, a wood-panelled room lined with books, and overlooked by a portrait of Sir Henry Fenwick, Sylvia's late husband. She had a purpose: to learn more about Richard, whose life might illuminate his death. On a side table, she found a leather-bound sketchbook, its pages filled with Richard's drawings. The sketches were vivid, portraits of Clara, her face rendered with almost obsessive detail, landscapes of the estate, the shrine prominent, and strange angular symbols that Miss Marple, with her limited knowledge of archaeology, took to be inspired by Astarte's ancient worship. One page, torn at the edge, bore a half-finished sketch of the shrine at twilight, with a shadowy figure in the foreground. The figure's face was indistinct, but the posture suggested secrecy, perhaps a meeting. Miss Marple tucked the sketchbook under her arm, intending to show it to Craddock. As she left the library, she encountered Inspector Craddock in the hall, his face etched with frustration. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said, tipping his hat. "This case is a devil's knot. No fingerprints, no clear witnesses, and half the guests too foxed to remember their own names." He gestured to a notebook in his hand. "I've been talking to the staff. Seems Richard had a row with Sylvia last week. Something about selling the estate. He was dead against it. Said the shrine was sacred ground." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "Sacred to whom, I wonder? Richard struck me as an artist, not a mystic." She handed him the sketchbook, pointing to the torn page. "This may be nothing, but it suggests Richard was meeting someone at the shrine, perhaps regularly." Craddock flipped through the pages, his interest piqued. "Good find. I'll have my men check the garden again. Meanwhile, I'm off to question the groundskeeper. Care to join me?" She declined, preferring to pursue her own inquiries. The shrine, she decided, warranted a closer look. Slipping into the garden, she navigated the gravel paths, her sensible shoes crunching softly. The police tape fluttered in the breeze, but the constable on duty, recognizing her from Craddock's approval, let her pass. The shrine was less imposing. By day, its stones moss-covered, the statue's features softened by weathering. Miss Marple circled it slowly, her eyes scanning the ground. Near the statue's base, she noticed a patch of earth scuffed and uneven, as if trodden by hurried feet. Beyond the circle, a hedge bore a faint tear in its foliage, suggesting someone had pushed through in haste. She made a mental note, recalling a St. Mary Mead incident where a broken twig had led to a poacher's lair. Returning to the house, Miss Marple sought out Clara, finding her in the conservatory, staring at a potted orchid. "Miss Vane," she said gently, settling beside her, "I know this is a dreadful time, but might we talk?" Clara's eyes, red-rimmed, met hers with a flicker of wariness. "Of course, Miss Marple. What do you want to know?" Her voice was soft, but there was a guarded edge, like an actress preparing for a difficult scene. Miss Marple smiled, her manner disarming. "Richard was so young, so talented. You must have been very close." Clara nodded, her fingers twisting a handkerchief. "We were engaged. He was everything to me." Yet her words, though heartfelt, lacked conviction. Miss Marple pressed gently. "He seemed fond of the shrine. Did he share its history with you?" Clara hesitated, then shook her head. "He was obsessed with it, always sketching, talking about its power. I thought it was just his art, but lately he was distant." Her voice broke, and she looked away. Miss Marple noted the pause, the shift in Clara's demeanour. "Distant?" she prompted. Clara bit her lip. "He'd go to the shrine at odd hours, alone. I asked him why, but he wouldn't say. I thought perhaps he was planning something for the party." Her eyes darted to Miss Marple, then away, as if fearing she'd said too much. Miss Marple, sensing a wall, changed tack. "You're an actress, my dear. You must see so much of human nature on the stage." Clara relaxed slightly, nodding. "It's all masks, isn't it? People hide who they are." The irony of her words hung between them, and Miss Marple filed it away. As Clara excused herself, Miss Marple lingered in the conservatory, her thoughts turning to Sylvia's talk of curses. She had little patience for superstition, but she knew its power to unsettle. Sylvia's insistence on Astarte's wrath suggested either genuine belief or a convenient distraction. Miss Marple recalled a St. Mary Mead spinster who'd blamed a haunted well for her pilfered silver, only to be exposed as the thief. Sylvia, she suspected, was no thief, but her fear might mask something else. Guilt, perhaps, or knowledge of Richard's enemies. At luncheon, the guests were subdued, their conversations punctuated by awkward silences. Mrs. Price, undeterred, approached Miss Marple with a conspiratorial air. "Miss Marple, you're a clever one," she said, her voice a stage whisper. "I've heard you solve mysteries in your village. What do you make of this?" Her eyes gleamed with curiosity, and Miss Marple, though wary of her penchant for exaggeration, saw an opportunity. "I make very little, Mrs. Price," she said modestly, "but I'm sure you've noticed things I've missed." Flattered, Mrs. Price leaned closer. "Well, I saw Clara at the shrine a few weeks ago, arguing with someone. A man, I think, though it was dark. She was furious, shaking her fist. And Richard, poor boy, he was always there, sketching or muttering to himself. I told Sylvia it wasn't healthy, but she just laughed." Miss Marple nodded, encouraging her. "And this man, did you recognize him?" Mrs. Price frowned. "No, but he was tall, and his voice was sharp, like a gentleman's. I didn't stay long, too chilly for my bones." The information, though vague, was a thread to follow. Miss Marple thanked her, then sought out Craddock, who was reviewing statements in the study. She relayed Mrs. Price's story, adding her observations at the shrine. Craddock rubbed his chin. "Clara's holding something back, I'd wager. And those scuff marks, my men found them too, along with a cigarette, end Turkish, not common here. Richard didn't smoke, but Haydock does." He paused, eyeing Miss Marple. "You think the shrine's a red herring, don't you?" "Not entirely," she replied. "It's a stage inspector, and someone chose it carefully. But the motive lies elsewhere, in the heart of someone who knew Richard well." She thought of Clara's wariness, Haydock's polish, Sylvia's fear. Each was a piece of the puzzle, but the picture remained incomplete. As the afternoon waned, Miss Marple returned to the garden, drawn again to the shrine. The clouds had parted, casting a pale light over the stones. She stood by the statue, her eyes tracing its contours. Astarte, goddess of love and war. How fitting, she thought, for a crime born of passion or betrayal. In St. Mary Mead, she had seen love turn to hate, war erupt in quiet drawing rooms. Here, at Fernley Hall, the same forces were at play, hidden beneath costumes and rituals. She tightened her shawl, her resolve firm. The shadow of Astarte might loom, but it was human hands that wielded the dagger, and she would find them. Chapter 4. The Doctor's Discretion. The second day at Fernley Hall unfolded under a pall of suspicion, the estate's grandeur dimmed by the lingering shock of Richard Fenwick's murder. Miss Jane Marple, ever an early riser, sat in the morning room, her knitting needles clicking softly as she observed the subdued comings and goings of the household. The grey light filtering through the tall windows matched the mood of the guests, who moved with the cautious deliberation of those aware. They were under scrutiny. Inspector Craddock's investigation had tightened its grip, with constables stationed at the estate's entrances and a palpable tension threading through every conversation. Miss Marple, though outwardly occupied with her wool, was attuned to the undercurrents, her mind sifting through the fragments of evidence and human behaviour she had gathered. The previous day's discoveries, the scuffed earth near the Astarte shrine, the Turkish cigarette end, the torn sketch in Richard's book, had sharpened her focus. Yet it was the people, not the objects, that held the key. In St. Mary Mead, she had learned that motives were often betrayed by the smallest gestures, a averted glance, a too quick smile. Here, among Fernley Hall's eclectic cast, she sensed secrets coiled like springs, ready to snap. Dr. Maurice Haydock, with his polished charm and evasive air, had caught her attention most keenly. His role in pronouncing Richard's death had been efficient, almost rehearsed, and his interactions with the other guests carried a subtle authority that intrigued her. At breakfast, Miss Marple noted Haydock's absence, though his name surfaced in Mrs. Lavinia Price's ceaseless chatter. "Dr. Haydock was so calm last night," Mrs. Price remarked to a weary-looking guest, her voice carrying across the table. "You'd think he sees murders every day." Miss Marple, buttering her toast, filed the comment away. Calmness could be a virtue or a mask, and she intended to learn which applied to the doctor. Sylvia, still shaken, mentioned that Haydock had offered to assist Craddock with the coroner's report, a gesture that struck Miss Marple as both helpful and opportunistic. Seizing a moment after breakfast, Miss Marple decided to seek out Haydock herself. She found him in the garden strolling near a rose arbour, his tweed jacket immaculate despite the morning's damp. "Dr. Haydock," she called, her tone mild, "might I have a word?" He turned, his smile immediate but guarded, like a man, accustomed to deflecting inquiries. "Miss Marple, of course, enjoying the roses?" His voice was smooth with a hint of mockery, as if he doubted her interest in horticulture. "They're lovely," she replied, falling into step beside him. "But I confess, I'm more curious about people than plants. Richard, for instance. Such a tragedy. You knew him well, I presume?" Haydock's smile tightened, though his pace remained steady. "Well enough. He was Sylvia's stepson, a bit of a dreamer. Artists often are." His tone was dismissive, but Miss Marple caught a flicker in his eyes, a wariness that belied his casual words. She pressed gently, her voice as soft as her shawl. "He seemed troubled from what I've heard. Perhaps his health. You're a doctor, after all." Haydock hesitated, his fingers brushing the stem of a rose. Richard was fit, physically, but he was anxious lately. Money troubles, I suspect. Artists rarely manage their finances well. His answer was plausible, yet Miss Marple sensed a deliberate vagueness. She changed tack, gesturing to his wrist. "That's a fine watch, Doctor. An heirloom?" The watch, gold and engraved with the initials CV, had caught her eye the previous day, its presence on Haydock's wrist an anomaly. He glanced at it, his smile thinning. A gift from a grateful patient, nothing more. His tone was final, but Miss Marple noted the way his hand slipped into his pocket, as if to hide the watch from further scrutiny. She nodded, her expression serene, though her mind raced. "CV, could stand for Clara Vane, Richard's fiancée, whose guarded demeanour suggested secrets of her own. A gift from a patient was a convenient explanation, but in St. Mary Mead, such gifts often carried deeper stories. A farmer's watch, given by a lover, had once unravelled a scandal. Their walk ended at the garden's edge, where Haydock excused himself, claiming a need to consult with Craddock. Miss Marple watched him go, her thoughts turning to the cigarette end found near the shrine. Haydock's preference for Turkish tobacco, noted by Craddock, was a small but significant thread. She resolved to observe him further, suspecting his discretion masked more than professional reserve. In the drawing-room, Miss Marple found Craddock reviewing statements, his brow furrowed. "Miss Marple," he greeted, "you've a knack for turning up where there's work to be done." She smiled, settling into a chair. "Only where there's truth to be found, Inspector. Have you learned more about the dagger?" Craddock sighed, flipping open his notebook. "It's one of Sylvia's props, as we thought. Kept in a display case in the hall, accessible to anyone. No prints, no blood on the case. Our killer was careful." Miss Marple nodded, her needles resuming their rhythm. Careful, yes, but not invisible. The cigarette end, for instance. Dr. Haydock smokes Turkish, does he not? Craddock's eyes sharpened. "He does. Admitted it when I asked, but claims he was nowhere near the shrine before the ritual. Says he was in the house, chatting with a guest." He paused, tapping his pencil. "Trouble is, no one can confirm it. The guest, a Mr. Langley, says he was too drunk to recall." "A convenient lapse," Miss Marple murmured. She shared her conversation with Haydock, mentioning the watch and his reticence about Richard's state of mind. Craddock jotted a note. "I'll press him again. Meanwhile, we've got another lead. The dagger's angle, deep, slightly upward, suggests a left-handed strike. Narrows the field a bit." He listed the left-handed suspects: Sylvia, Clara, Haydock, and 2 minor guests, a solicitor and a local poet. Miss Marple tilted her head. "Unless, of course, the killer used their offhand to mislead. I recall a case in St. Mary Mead where a right-handed thief threw a stone with his left to confuse the vicar." Craddock chuckled, though his expression remained grim. "You're a step ahead, as usual. I've also got something from the staff. Tom, the footman, says he saw Haydock arguing with Mrs. Price yesterday near the conservatory. Something about meddling in Richard's affairs. Mrs. Price clammed up when I asked, but I'll try her again." Miss Marple's eyes brightened. "Mrs. Price does love to talk. Perhaps I'll have a word with her myself." She found Mrs. Price in the library, leafing through a volume of local history, her peacock feathers replaced by a garish scarf. "Miss Marple!" she exclaimed, her voice a mix of delight and nerves. "This house is positively Gothic, isn't it? Murder, curses, I shan't sleep a wink." Miss Marple smiled, settling beside her. "It's unsettling, certainly. But you've a sharp eye, Mrs. Price. I heard you had words with Dr. Haydock yesterday. Something about Richard." Mrs. Price's cheeks flushed, her fingers twisting the scarf. "Oh, that! Just a silly spat. I told Maurice, Dr. Haydock, that is, that he was too nosy about Richard's plans, always asking questions, poking into his finances. Richard didn't like it, you know. Said Maurice was scheming." She leaned closer, her voice dropping. "I think Maurice was jealous of Richard. All that charm, that talent. Men can be so petty." Her words tumbled out, a mix of gossip and insight, and Miss Marple listened patiently, sorting truth from embellishment. "Did Richard mention what Maurice was scheming about?" she asked. Mrs. Price frowned, thinking, "Not exactly. Something about the estate, I think. Richard was furious, said he'd put a stop to it. I didn't pry, well, not much." She laughed nervously, and Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning to Haydock's possible motives. Jealousy, financial intrigue, or something more personal, tied to the watch and its initials. She thanked Mrs. Price, who seemed relieved to have unburdened herself, and returned to the drawing-room. There, she overheard a snippet of conversation between two maids, one mentioning a blooded glove found in the shrubbery near the shrine. Intrigued, Miss Marple sought Craddock, who confirmed the find. "A man's glove, leather, stained with blood," he said. "Too large for a woman's hand, and the blood matches Richard's type. Problem is, no one's claiming it, and it's got no distinct marks." Miss Marple tilted her head. "A glove left behind? That's careless unless it was meant to be found. In St. Mary Mead, a dropped scarf once pointed to the wrong suspect, deliberately placed." Craddock's eyes narrowed. "You think it's a plant?" She shrugged, her expression mild. "I think our killer is clever, but not flawless. The glove, the cigarette, the dagger's angle, all pieces of a puzzle. We mustn't assume they fit as they seem." He nodded, assigning a constable to trace the glove's origin, though he admitted the task was daunting with so many guests. As the afternoon wore on, Miss Marple reflected on Haydock's role. His discretion, she sensed, was a shield, hiding either guilt or knowledge. The watch, the argument with Mrs. Price, the cigarette end, all circled him like moths around a flame. Yet she cautioned herself against haste. In St. Mary Mead, a hasty assumption had once led her to suspect the wrong grocer's boy of pilfering. Here the stakes were higher, the players more complex. She thought of Clara, whose wariness suggested a connection to Haydock, and Sylvia, whose fear might stem from more than superstition. By evening, the house settled into an uneasy quiet, the guests retiring early under Craddock's watchful eye. Miss Marple, knitting by the fire, felt the weight of the case pressing in. Haydock's discretion, like the shrine's shadows, obscured the truth, but she was patient. The doctor, she suspected, held a piece of the puzzle, whether as culprit or witness. She tightened her shawl, her resolve unwavering. In Fernley Hall, as in St. Mary Mead, secrets could not hide forever, and she would coax them into the light, one careful stitch at a time. Chapter 5. The Actress's Mask. The third day at Fernley Hall dawned with a restless energy. The estate cloaked in a mist that curled around its ancient stones like a shroud. Miss Jane Marple, seated by her bedroom window, watched the fog drift. Over the gardens, her knitting needles paused in mid-stitch. The murder of Richard Fenwick had cast a long shadow, and the threads of suspicion, Dr. Haydock's guarded charm, Sylvia's fragile nerves, the blooded glove, wove a pattern that was tantalizingly incomplete. Yet it was Clara Vane, Richard's fiancée, who now occupied Miss Marple's thoughts. The young actress's grief, so vividly displayed, carried a note of performance, as if she played a role even in her sorrow. In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had seen such masks. A shopgirl's tears masking theft, a widow's wails hiding greed, and she sensed Clara's emotions, however raw, concealed a deeper truth. Breakfast was a subdued affair. The dining room, hushed save for the clink of cutlery and Mrs. Lavinia Price's occasional murmur about the weather. Clara was absent, her chair empty, and Sylvia, pale as porcelain, barely touched her tea. Dr. Haydock, ever composed, conversed lightly with a guest, his laughter jarring in the sombre air. Miss Marple, nibbling a scone, noted the glances cast toward Clara's place, the unspoken questions hanging like the mist outside. Inspector Craddock, entering with a brisk nod, announced that interviews would continue, and no one was to leave the estate. His eyes met Miss Marple's briefly, a silent acknowledgment of her role as his unofficial ally. After breakfast, Miss Marple sought Clara, guided by a maid to the actress's room on the second floor. The corridor, lined with portraits of stern, Fenwick ancestors, felt oppressive, the air heavy with the scent of old wood and wax. She knocked softly, and Clara's voice, muffled but polite, bid her enter. The room was a study in contrasts. A four-poster bed draped in silk, a modern dressing table cluttered with cosmetics, and Clara herself, seated by a window, her auburn hair loose, her face bare of makeup. She wore a simple grey dress, but her posture, shoulders squared, chin lifted, suggested a stage presence, even in solitude. "Miss Marple," Clara said, rising with a faint smile, "I didn't expect you. Please, sit." Her voice was warm, but her eyes, red from crying, held a wariness that Miss Marple recognized. She settled into a chair, her knitting bag at her feet, and adopted her most disarming tone. "My dear, I hope I'm not intruding. I only thought you might need a listener, someone outside this dreadful affair." Clara's smile wavered, and she sank back into her seat, clutching a handkerchief. "You're kind. It's just Richard. I can't believe he's gone." Miss Marple nodded, her expression sympathetic. "A terrible loss. You were to be married, weren't you? Such plans, such dreams." Her words were gentle, but her eyes were sharp, watching Clara's reaction. The actress's fingers tightened on the handkerchief, and she looked away, toward the mist-shrouded garden. "Yes, we were. He was everything to me, his art, his passion. It was like living in a story." Her voice trembled, but Miss Marple detected a practiced cadence, as if Clara had rehearsed these lines. "You must have shared so much," Miss Marple continued, her tone encouraging. "His sketches, for instance, those of the shrine. He seemed devoted to it." Clara's eyes flickered, a brief shadow crossing her face. "He was. Too devoted, perhaps. He'd spend hours there, drawing, thinking. I didn't always understand it." She paused, then added almost too quickly, "He said it inspired him, gave his work depth." Miss Marple tilted her head, her needles resuming their soft click. "And you, my dear? Did the shrine inspire you?" Clara laughed, a brittle sound. "Me? I'm no artist. I told him it was eerie, all those stones and that statue staring down. But he loved it." Her words were dismissive, but her hands betrayed her, twisting the handkerchief into knots. Miss Marple, recalling the torn sketch of a shadowy figure, pressed gently. "He must have shared his plans, his worries. Young men often confide in those they love." Clara's lips parted, then closed, her gaze dropping to her lap, He was private lately. Said he had things to sort out. I thought it was the estate or money." The hesitation was telling, and Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice soft as a whisper. "Or perhaps someone else? A rival? A friend?" Clara's head snapped up, her eyes wide with alarm. "No, I mean, he didn't mention anyone. Why would you think that?" Her denial was swift, but her cheeks flushed, and Miss Marple noted the slip. In St. Mary Mead, a girl's blush had once betrayed a secret lover. Here, Clara's reaction suggested a truth she was desperate to conceal. Before Miss Marple could probe further, Clara rose, crossing to the dressing table. "I'm sorry, I'm not myself. Let me show you something." She rummaged through a drawer and produced a letter, its paper creased and slightly torn. "Richard wrote this a few days ago. I found it in his things after it happened. I haven't shown the police yet. I don't know if it matters." She handed it to Miss Marple, her hands trembling. Miss Marple unfolded the letter, her eyes scanning the hurried script. It read, "Clara, I've sensed a betrayal, though I can't yet name it. The shrine holds answers, but also danger. If anything happens to me, trust no one." The words were cryptic, the tone urgent, and Miss Marple felt a chill, not unlike the one she'd felt when a St. Mary Mead farmer's note had hinted at foul play. "This is important, my dear," she said, folding the letter carefully. "You must show it to Inspector Craddock at once." Clara nodded, her face pale. "I will. I didn't want to believe he was afraid." Miss Marple studied her, sensing the letter was both a clue and a performance. Clara's decision to share it now, to her rather than Craddock, suggested calculation, perhaps a desire to shape the narrative. She thanked Clara and left, the letter tucked into her bag, her mind racing. The word betrayal echoed, pointing to a rift in Richard's world, romantic, financial, or familial. Clara's guardedness, coupled with Haydock's watch and Mrs. Price's gossip, formed a constellation of suspicion, but the stars did not yet align. In the hall, Miss Marple encountered Sylvia, who was arranging flowers with a distracted air. "Jane, you're a comfort in this madness," Sylvia said, her voice brittle. "Clara's taking it so hard, poor girl. And now, this talk of séances. Some of the guests want to contact Richard's spirit. I've half a mind to allow it, if only to calm them." Miss Marple's lips pursed, her distaste for such theatrics evident. "I'd advise against it, Sylvia. It's likely to stir more trouble than it settles." Sylvia sighed, her hands faltering among the roses. "You're right, of course, but I feel so helpless." Miss Marple patted her arm, her mind elsewhere. A séance, though nonsense, might reveal reactions worth noting. She suggested Sylvia proceed, but with caution, and made her way to Craddock, whom she found in the study, poring over a map of the estate. "Miss Marple," he greeted, "you look like you've found something." She handed him the letter, recounting her talk with Clara. Craddock's brow furrowed as he read. "Betrayal, eh? That's a motive if ever I heard one. But it's vague. Could mean anything from a lover's spat to a business deal gone sour." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed, her eyes bright. "Clara's reluctance to share it sooner is curious. She's an actress, Inspector, and actresses know how to choose their moments." Craddock nodded, slipping the letter into an evidence bag. "I'll question her again. Meanwhile, we've traced the glove's leather to a London shop, but it's A common brand. No luck there. And Haydock's alibi is still shaky. Mr. Langley's memory hasn't improved. He paused, eyeing her. You're thinking of the séance, aren't you? Sylvia mentioned it. Miss Marple smiled faintly. I am. It's foolish, but people reveal themselves when they're unsettled. I'll attend, if only to watch. Craddock grunted, his scepticism clear. Watch closely, then. I'll have a man there, just in case. The séance was set for that evening, in the drawing-room, its heavy curtains drawn to create a suitably eerie atmosphere. Sylvia, reluctant but swayed by the guest's insistence, presided, her crimson shawl a nod to her Astarte costume. A medium, a nervous woman named Miss Gresham, had been summoned from the village, her credentials dubious, but her enthusiasm undeniable. The guests gathered around a round table, their faces tense. Clara, pale and clutching a locket. Haydock, his smile sceptical. Mrs. Price, her eyes gleaming with anticipation, and a handful of others, their curiosity outweighing their grief. Miss Marple, seated near the back, knitted quietly, her presence overlooked by all but Craddock's. Constable, who stood by the door, Miss Gresham lit candles, their flames casting shadows on the walls. We seek Richard Fenwick's spirit, she intoned, her voice quavering. Join hands and focus. The room fell silent, save for the creak of the house and the distant patter of rain. Miss Marple watched the faces, noting Clara's tight grip on Haydock's hand, Haydock's faint smirk, Sylvia's closed eyes. The medium droned on, her chants growing fervent, when suddenly a low, eerie voice filled the room, unmistakably Richard's. A false heart betrayed me at the shrine, it whispered, chilling the air. Clara gasped, her locket falling to the table as she fainted, her head slumping forward. Haydock leapt to her side, his face taut, while Mrs. Price shrieked, clutching Sylvia. The other guests erupted in murmurs, some crossing themselves. Miss Marple, unmoved, peered at the table's edge, where a faint wire glinted. A recording device, she suspected, hidden by the medium or another. Craddock's constable moved to restore order, and Miss Gresham, flustered, claimed the voice was genuine. Sylvia, trembling, called for lights, ending the farce. As the guests dispersed, Miss Marple lingered, examining the table. The wire led to a small speaker, clumsily concealed beneath a cloth. She pointed it out to Craddock, who swore under his breath. A trick, then. But why? To scare someone or point fingers? Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. To unsettle, I think. Clara's feint was convenient, and Haydock's rush to her side revealing. She recalled a St. Mary Mead prank, where a faked ghost had flushed out a blackmailer. Here, the voice had served a purpose, though whose, she wasn't yet sure. Later, she spoke with Clara, who had recovered but remained shaken. That voice, it was Richard, Clara whispered, her eyes wide. He's accusing someone. Miss Marple, gentle but firm, suggested it was a cruel hoax. My dear, the living are far more dangerous than the dead. Tell me, did Richard ever speak of a false heart? Clara shook her head, but her hesitation was telling, and Miss Marple left her, convinced the actress's mask was slipping. The séance had cracked the façade of Fernley Hall, exposing fears and alliances. Clara's performance, Haydock's vigilance, the staged voice, all were clues, pointing to a truth buried in jealousy or betrayal. Miss Marple, knitting by the fire that night, felt the pattern taking shape. In St. Mary Mead, she had unravelled lies with patience. Here, she would do the same, peeling back the actress's mask to reveal the heart beneath. Chapter 6. The Widow's Tale. The fourth day at Fernley Hall broke with a fragile calm, the mist of the previous morning giving way to a pale sun that did little to lift the gloom within the estate. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her room with a cup of tea, reflected on the séance's unsettling theatrics and the undercurrents it had exposed. The recorded voice, Clara's dramatic feint, and Dr. Haydock's swift intervention had added layers to the puzzle of Richard Fenwick's murder. But the pieces remained stubbornly misaligned. Her knitting lay idle, her mind tracing the threads of suspicion. Clara's guarded grief, Haydock's calculated charm, Sylvia's brittle fear. Yet it was Mrs. Lavinia Price, the garrulous widow with a penchant for gossip, who now drew Miss Marple's attention. In St. Mary Mead, such women often held the key to secrets, their chatter a minefield of half-truths and unwitting revelations. Downstairs, the household moved sluggishly, the guests worn by sleepless nights and Craddock's relentless inquiries. Breakfast was a muted affair, with Sylvia absent, Clara picking at her plate, and Haydock exchanging clipped pleasantries with a solicitor guest. Mrs. Price, her scarf a riot of crimson, held court at the table's end, her voice carrying tales of Devon's haunted moors. Miss Marple, slipping into a seat nearby, listened with half an ear, her eyes noting the widow's animated gestures. Mrs. Price's gossip, though often embellished, had already yielded the clue of Clara's argument. At the shrine, Miss Marple suspected more lay buried in her prattle, waiting to be sifted like gold from river silt. After breakfast, Miss Marple found Mrs. Price in the morning room, leafing through a fashion magazine with exaggerated sighs. "Miss Marple," she exclaimed, her eyes lighting up, "you're a beacon of sense in this dreadful place. All this talk of ghosts and daggers, I declare it's like living in a novel." Her laugh was forced, and Miss Marple, settling beside her, smiled gently. "It is unsettling, Mrs. Price, but you've a keen eye, I've noticed. You see things others miss." The flattery was deliberate, and Mrs. Price preened, her scarf fluttering as she leaned closer. "Oh, I do watch, Miss Marple. People are so careless, aren't they? Take Richard, such a charming boy but reckless, borrowing money left and right, always promising some grand venture." Her voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. "He came to me, you know, a month ago. Asked for a loan, £500, no less. Said he'd repay it soon, with interest from a new project. I gave it, of course. I've a soft spot for artists." She paused, her eyes narrowing. But he was secretive, always at that shrine, muttering about its potential. I told Sylvia it was unhealthy, but she just waved it off. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her expression attentive. £500 is a tidy sum. Did he say what the project was? Mrs. Price shook her head, her lips pursing. Not a word, though I pressed him. Something about the estate, I think, restoring it, or using the shrine for some scheme. He was cagey, kept glancing at the door, as if he feared being overheard. She leaned closer, her voice a hiss. And Clara? Oh, she was cross about it. I saw her at the shrine one night, weeks before the party, arguing with a man. Not Richard, mind you, taller, older. She was shaking her fist, saying, "You've no right." I couldn't see his face, but his voice was sharp, like a gentleman's. The story aligned with Mrs. Price's earlier hint, but the details were fresher, less embellished. Miss Marple tilted her head, her mind turning to Haydock, whose height and polished manner fit the description. "How intriguing," she murmured. "And this man? Did you hear anything else?" Mrs. Price frowned, thinking. "Just snatches. Something about promises and debts." I didn't linger. It was chilly, and I'm not one for eavesdropping. Her coy smile suggested otherwise, and Miss Marple suppressed a chuckle, recalling a St. Mary Mead busybody whose overheard secrets had solved a burglary. "Did you tell Richard about this argument?" Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Price's eyes widened. "Goodness, no. He was touchy about Clara, always saying she was misunderstood. But I did mention it to Sylvia, who laughed and said Clara was just rehearsing a scene. Rehearsing at midnight, in the dark, I ask you." Her indignation was genuine, and Miss Marple nodded, filing the information away. Clara's nocturnal dispute, coupled with Richard's loan, suggested financial or romantic entanglements, perhaps both. The shrine, it seemed, was more than a backdrop. It was a nexus of secrets. Thanking Mrs. Price, Miss Marple sought out Craddock, finding him in the library, where he was examining bank records with a constable. "Miss Marple," he greeted, his face weary. "You're a sight for sore eyes. These ledgers are a nightmare. Richard was bleeding money, but we can't trace where it went." She relayed Mrs. Price's tale, emphasizing the loan and Clara's argument. Craddock's brow furrowed. £500? That's no small debt. And this man at the shrine sounds like Haydock, though we've no proof. His alibi's still shaky, and that cigarette end keeps nagging at me. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes bright. "The shrine seems central, Inspector, not as a curse, but as a meeting place. Richard's sketches, Clara's argument, his loan, all point there. Have you searched it again?" Craddock sighed, rubbing his neck. "Twice, but I'll send my men back. We did find something odd, though." He gestured to a photograph on the table showing scuff marks in the earth, some distance from the statue. These were 20 feet from where Richard fell. Suggests a struggle, or someone dragging him to stage the scene. The revelation was significant, and Miss Marple's mind raced. In St. Mary Mead, a misplaced footprint had once betrayed a poacher. Here, the scuff marks hinted at a calculated act. The body moved to align with the ritual's drama. "A staged scene," she mused, "requires planning. Our killer knew the shrine's effect, its shadows. But those marks, someone was careless or rushed." Craddock nodded, jotting a note. "I'll have the area combed again." Meanwhile, Sylvia's confirmed Richard was pushing some scheme to revive the shrine. Public rituals, tourists, that sort of thing. She thought it was nonsense, but he was adamant. The idea of Richard monetizing the shrine intrigued Miss Marple, suggesting a motive tied to money or control. She recalled Mrs. Price's mention of debts and promises, and Haydock's alleged scheming. Was Richard's venture a threat to someone? Sylvia, who owned the estate, or Haydock, whose financial interest remained unclear? She suggested Craddock question the staff about visitors to the shrine, particularly at night, and he agreed, assigning a constable to the task. Leaving the library, Miss Marple decided to verify Mrs. Price's story herself. Wary of the widow's tendency to embroider, she found a maid, Ellen, polishing silver in the pantry, and struck up a conversation, her manner disarming. "Ellen, you must see so much working here. Mrs. Price mentioned seeing Miss Vane at the shrine one night, arguing. Did you ever notice such a thing?" Ellen, a shy girl with quick eyes, hesitated, then nodded. "Once, ma'am, about a month back. I was fetching coals late, and I saw Miss Vane near the shrine, pacing. She was alone, though, talking to herself, like she was angry. I didn't stay. She looked fierce." The account differed from Mrs. Price's, casting doubt on the tall man, but confirming Clara's agitation. Miss Marple thanked Ellen, her thoughts turning to the actress's secretive behaviour. Clara's claim of ignorance about Richard's shrine obsession felt increasingly hollow, and the letter about betrayal suggested she knew more than she admitted. Miss Marple resolved to watch her closely, suspecting the actress's mask hid a pivotal truth. By afternoon, the house buzzed with renewed tension as Craddock's men combed the grounds. Miss Marple, strolling near the shrine, overheard two constables discussing a new find. A scrap of fabric, silk and crimson, caught in a hedge near the scuff marks. The colour matched Sylvia's Astarte gown, worn during the ritual, and Miss Marple's heart quickened. Sylvia, with her fear of curses and her argument with Richard over the estate, was an unlikely killer. But the fabric demanded explanation. She sought Craddock, who was cataloguing the find with a frown. "It's Sylvia's, all right," he said. "She says her gown tore during the chaos, but she didn't notice where. Convenient, if you ask me." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression thoughtful. "Convenient or planted? In St. Mary Mead, a torn apron was left to implicate a cook, who proved innocent. Sylvia's fear seems genuine, but we mustn't rush to judge." Craddock nodded, though his scepticism was clear. "I'll question her again. She's been cagey about Richard's finances. Says he handled his own affairs, but I'm not so sure." As evening approached, Miss Marple joined the guests in the drawing-room, where Sylvia, pale but composed, served tea. Clara, her locket clutched tightly, avoided Haydock's gaze while Mrs. Price whispered to a guest about the fabric find, her excitement barely contained. Haydock, sipping brandy, seemed unruffled, though Miss Marple noted his hand linger near his watch, the initials CV glinting in the firelight. The widow's tale, with its hints of loans and arguments, had tightened the web around Clara and Haydock, but Sylvia's gown and Richard's scheme added new strands. Miss Marple, knitting by the hearth, felt the case's complexity like a tangled skein. Mrs. Price's gossip, though flawed, had illuminated Richard's desperation and Clara's secrecy. The shrine, with its scuff marks and torn fabric, was a stage for more than rituals. It was where motives converged. In St. Mary Mead, she had unravelled a theft by listening to a chatterbox seamstress. Here, the widow's tale was a stepping stone, leading her closer to the truth. She tightened her shawl, her resolve firm. The killer's hand was hidden, but not invisible, and she would trace its outline, one careful word at a time. Chapter 7. The Lover's Secret. The 5th day at Fernley Hall dawned with a brittle clarity, the sun piercing the morning haze to cast sharp shadows across the estate's sprawling lawns. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her room with a view of the high distant Astarte shrine, sipped her tea, her knitting untouched as her mind wove through the intricate tapestry of Richard Fenwick's murder. The clues amassed thus far: the scuffed earth, the crimson fabric, Mrs. Price's tales of loans and arguments, pointed to a crime rooted in human passions, not the mystical aura Sylvia so feared. Yet it was Clara Vane, the actress whose grief seemed both raw and rehearsed, who now held Miss Marple's focus. The letter hinting at betrayal, the nocturnal dispute at the shrine, and the initials on Dr. Haydock's watch all circled Clara, suggesting a secret tied to love or deceit. In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had seen such secrets unravel marriages and reputations. Here she sensed they had led to murder. The house stirred slowly, its guests and staff moving under the weight of Inspector Craddock's ongoing investigation. Breakfast was a tense affair, with Sylvia's hands trembling as she poured coffee, Clara's eyes downcast, and Haydock's conversation with a guest clipped and perfunctory. Mrs. Price, her scarf now a vivid emerald, whispered to a nervous young woman about the police's latest find, her voice a mix of thrill and dread. Miss Marple, seated near a window, observed the dynamics, noting Clara's isolation and Haydock's subtle glances toward her. The air was thick with unspoken questions, and Miss Marple, ever patient, knew that truths often surfaced when nerves were frayed. Her morning began with a resolve to probe Clara's relationship with Richard more deeply. The actress's guarded responses and the letter's cryptic warning suggested a rift, perhaps romantic, that had driven the killer's hand. Miss Marple found Clara in the conservatory, tending to a wilting fern with an air of distraction. "Miss Vane," she said, softly, approaching with her knitting bag, "may I join you? These plants are a comfort, aren't they, in such trying times?" Clara looked up, her face pale but composed, and nodded. "They are. Richard loved this place, said it was peaceful." Her voice was steady, but her fingers faltered, snapping a leaf. Miss Marple settled onto a wicker chair, her needles clicking gently. "He must have been a remarkable man. You shared so much, I imagine, his dreams, his fears." Clara's eyes flickered, a shadow of wariness crossing her face. "We did, at first, but lately he was consumed by the shrine. His sketches, he wouldn't talk about it, not really." Her words were careful, and Miss Marple, sensing a wall, shifted her approach. "Young men can be so private. In my village, a lad once hid his troubles from his sweetheart, and it led to such a muddle. Did Richard ever mention anyone troubling him?" Clara's hand stilled, and she met Miss Marple's gaze, her expression a mix of fear and defiance. "He didn't name anyone, but he was suspicious, always looking over his shoulder. I thought it was the money, or Sylvia's plans to sell the estate." She paused, then added, almost too casually, "He got calls, late at night. I heard him once arguing, but he brushed it off as business." The mention of calls was new, and Miss Marple's heart quickened, recalling a St. Mary Mead case where a phone call had exposed a blackmailer. "Calls at night?" she prompted, her tone mild. Clara nodded, her fingers twisting the fern's stem. "Yes, a few times. I asked who it was, but he said it was nothing, A creditor or a friend? I didn't push. Her voice faltered, and Miss Marple noted the lie, subtle but clear. Clara knew more, perhaps the caller's identity, and her reluctance to share suggested fear or complicity. "You're very loyal, my dear," Miss Marple said, her smile disarming. "But sometimes loyalty hides the truth. If you know anything, even a small thing, it could help." Clara's lips parted, then closed, and she shook her head. "I've told you all I can." The conversation ended with Clara excusing herself, her departure swift and uneasy. Miss Marple lingered, her mind turning to the calls. They hinted at an external pressure on Richard, possibly linked to his loan from Mrs. Price or his shrine scheme. Haydock, with his evasive air and Turkish cigarettes, loomed as a candidate, but so did others. Perhaps a creditor or someone tied to Clara. Miss Marple resolved to share the clue with Craddock, whose methodical approach might trace the call's origin. She found the inspector in the study, surrounded by papers, and a constable taking notes. "Miss Marple," Craddock greeted, his face etched with fatigue. "You're a welcome sight. This case is like chasing shadows." She relayed Clara's mention of the late-night calls, emphasizing the actress's hesitation. Craddock's eyes sharpened. "Calls, eh? That's new. Richard's bank records show withdrawals to an untraceable account. Could be blackmail or a debt. If we can trace those calls, we might find who was leaning on him." He jotted a note, then shared a new find. A groundskeeper had discovered a locket near the shrine, half buried in the soil, containing a photo of Clara and an inscription, "To my eternal love, M." The locket was a revelation, and Miss Marple's thoughts flew to Haydock, whose initials matched the M. "Maurice Haydock," she murmured, her needles pausing. "Or another M. We mustn't assume, but the locket near the shrine suggests a personal connection, perhaps a secret Clara kept from Richard." Craddock nodded, holding up the locket, its silver surface tarnished but intact. "It's hers, all right. She identified it, said she lost it weeks ago, but the groundskeeper swears it wasn't there before the party." He frowned, adding, "And the inscription, Clara clams up when I ask about it." The locket's discovery tightened the web around Clara and Haydock, and Miss Marple suggested a bold step. "Inspector, might you search Dr. Haydock's room? If he's linked to Clara, there may be evidence. A letter, perhaps, or another clue." Craddock hesitated, wary of overstepping, but her logic swayed him. "I'll get a warrant, but if we find nothing, it's a risk." Miss Marple smiled, faintly. In St. Mary Mead, a search of a gardener's shed once found a stolen ring. Risks sometimes are rewarded. The search was conducted discreetly, with Craddock and a constable entering Haydock's room while he was questioned elsewhere. Miss Marple, waiting in the hall, overheard the constable's report. They found a left-handed glove, leather and well-worn, hidden in a drawer. It matched the bloodied glove from the shrubbery in size and material, though it bore no stains. Craddock, joining her, was grim. "It's damning, but Haydock claims it was stolen from his room before the party. Says he hasn't worn it in weeks." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression thoughtful. "Stolen or planted? The glove, the locket, the cigarette, all point to him, yet it's almost too neat, like a script." Craddock grunted, his scepticism clear. "A script, maybe, but he's got no alibi, and that watch of his CV keeps nagging at me." I'm tracing those calls now. Got a man checking the exchange in London. If they lead to Haydock, we've got him." Miss Marple nodded, though her mind cautioned against haste. In St. Mary Mead, a too obvious clue, a dropped handkerchief, had once misled her, pointing to an innocent maid. Here, the evidence against Haydock was compelling, but Clara's role remained murky. To test her suspicions, Miss Marple sought out Tom, the footman, whose quiet observance had caught her eye on the night of the murder. She found him polishing boots in the servants' hall, his movements precise, but his eyes alert. "Tom," she said, her tone warm, "you've a good head, I can tell. You see things, don't you, working here?" Tom flushed, setting down a boot. "I try to, ma'am, but I keep my place." His voice was cautious, and Miss Marple, sensing his loyalty, chose her words carefully. "Of course you do," she said, "but a young man like you notices more than he says. Miss Vane, for instance, she's had a hard time. Did you ever see her troubled, perhaps, by those late calls?" Tom's eyes flickered, and he glanced at the door, ensuring they were alone. "I did, ma'am, once or twice. I was up late, fetching water for the guests, and I heard her phone ring. Past midnight it was. She answered in a whisper, sounded cross. I didn't hear much, but she said, 'You can't keep doing this.' I thought it was Mr. Fenwick, but he was in his room, asleep." The revelation was a goldmine, and Miss Marple's heart quickened. "You're sure it wasn't Richard?" Tom nodded, his face earnest. "Sure as I can be, ma'am. Mr. Fenwick's room was dark, and I saw him earlier, tired out. It was someone else." Miss Marple thanked him, her mind racing. The calls, not from Richard but to Clara, suggested an affair or a threat, with Haydock as the likely caller. The locket's M and the watch's initials formed a damning link. But she needed more to confirm the lover's secret. Returning to Craddock, she shared Tom's account, urging him to prioritize the phone records. "If those calls trace to Dr. Haydock," she said, "we have a motive, jealousy perhaps, or fear of exposure. Richard's letter mentioned betrayal. He may have suspected Clara's infidelity." Craddock's eyes narrowed, and he promised results by evening, his men already coordinating with the London Exchange. He also revealed a new wrinkle. Sylvia had admitted Richard's shrine scheme involved a partner, someone he'd met in London, but she didn't know their name. Could be Haydock, Craddock mused, or someone else entirely. By afternoon, the house was abuzz with the search's aftermath, whispers of the glove spreading among the guests. Haydock, confronted by Craddock, maintained his composure, insisting the glove was a coincidence and his watch a mere gift. Clara, questioned separately, grew tearful, denying any recent contact with Haydock beyond casual acquaintance. Yet Miss Marple, observing her in the drawing-room, noted her clenched hands and the way her eyes avoided Haydock's. The actress's mask was cracking, but whether from guilt or fear, Miss Marple couldn't yet tell. As evening fell, Craddock delivered a breakthrough. The phone records showed multiple late-night calls to Clara's line, originating from a London number registered to Haydock's practice. "It's not proof of murder," Craddock said, "but it's enough to haul him in for questioning. He's got some explaining to do." Miss Marple nodded, her expression grave. "He does, but we must be sure. In St. Mary Mead, a phone call once pointed to the wrong man, a jealous suitor who was innocent of theft. Here, Haydock may be our man, or a pawn in a larger game. The day ended with Haydock under scrutiny, the guests whispering about his arrest. Miss Marple, knitting by the fire, felt the case's pulse quickening. The lover's secret, Clara's calls, Haydock's glove, the locket's inscription, was a thread leading to the heart of the crime. Yet the shrine's role, Sylvia's torn gown, and Richard's mysterious partner lingered, shadows in the pattern. In St. Mary Mead, she had unravelled a scandal by following a lover's trail. Here she would do the same, her patience a quiet blade cutting through the lies. Chapter 8. The Veil Lifted. The 6th day at Fernley Hall bore the weight of a storm about to break, the air thick with anticipation as Inspector Craddock's investigation neared its climax. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her room with a view of the Astarte Shrine's distant stones, sipped her morning tea, her knitting needles silent. The threads of Richard Fenwick's murder, Clara's guarded calls, Haydock's incriminating glove, the locket's cryptic inscription, had woven a tight net, yet the final knot eluded her. The evidence pointed to Dr. Maurice Haydock, whose charm masked a tangle of motives, but Miss Marple, schooled by St. Mary Mead's deceptions, knew truth often hid behind the obvious. Today she resolved to unravel the case, drawing the suspects together to expose the killer's hand. In her village, such gatherings had flushed out thieves and liars. Here they would reveal a murderer. The house stirred with a nervous energy, the guests aware that Craddock's net was tightening. Breakfast was a strained ritual, with Sylvia's hands unsteady as she served toast, Clara's face pale and drawn, and Mrs. Price's chatter subdued, her emerald scarf muted by a grey shawl. Haydock, under close watch, maintained his composure, his smile a polished shield as he conversed with a minor guest. Miss Marple, nibbling a piece of marmalade-laden bread, observed the dynamics. Clara's avoidance of Haydock, Sylvia's fleeting glances at the garden, Mrs. Price's restless fingers. The room felt like a stage, the players poised for a final act. Miss Marple sought Craddock in the study, where he was reviewing a telegram from London. "Miss Marple," he greeted, his voice taut, "you've a knack for timing. The phone records are solid. Haydock's number called Clara's line 6 times in the fortnight before the murder, all after midnight. He's admitted to speaking with her, but claims it was professional advice about her nerves. Rubbish, if you ask me." He tapped the telegram, and we've traced Richard's mystery partner, a London promoter named Merton, who backed out of the shrine scheme days before the party. Says Richard was furious, threatened to expose some dealings. Doesn't sound like Haydock, but it muddies the water. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes bright. Muddied waters often hide the clearest truths, Inspector. Haydock's calls, the glove, the locket, all suggest a personal motive, likely jealousy, but the shrine's staging, the scuff marks, the crimson fabric, these point to calculation, not passion alone. She paused, her mind tracing the case's arc. "I'd like to gather the suspects, Inspector, in the drawing room. A conversation? Nothing formal, but it may shake loose the final piece." Craddock's brow rose, but he trusted her instincts. "I'll arrange it. Sylvia, Clara, Haydock, Mrs. Price, anyone else?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "That will do. And Tom, the footman, if you please. He sees more than he says. The gathering was set for late afternoon. The drawing-room's heavy curtains parted to let in a wan light. Miss Marple arrived early, her knitting bag at her side, and surveyed the room. Plush armchairs, a marble fireplace, a portrait of Sir Henry Fenwick glowering from the wall. The setting was perfect, its grandeur a counterpoint to the human frailties she would expose. Craddock positioned a constable by the door, his notebook ready, while Miss Marple took a seat near the fire, her shawl draped over her shoulders. The suspects filed in, their expressions a mix of curiosity and dread. Sylvia, clutching a handkerchief, Clara, her locket glinting, Haydock, his smile tight, Mrs. Price, her eyes darting, and Tom, stiff and silent, standing at the room's edge. "Miss Marple began, her voice soft but commanding, like a village matron addressing a parish meeting. "Thank you for coming," she said, her needles clicking gently. "This dreadful affair has weighed on us all, and I believe we're close to the truth. Richard Fenwick's death was no act of chance, nor the work of some ancient curse." She glanced at Sylvia, whose lips trembled. The shrine to Astarte, with its stones and shadows, was a stage chosen to confuse us. But murder, I find, is never so clever as it thinks. Sylvia stirred, her voice faint. "You don't believe in the curse, Miss Marple." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "My dear, I believe in people, their loves, their hates, their mistakes. Richard was killed by someone who knew him well, someone driven by a passion as old as that statue." She turned to Clara, whose hands clenched her locket. "Miss Vane, you loved Richard, yet he sensed a betrayal. His letter spoke of it, and your late-night calls suggest a secret you kept from him." Clara's face flushed, her voice sharp. "I told you, those calls were nothing. Rehearsals, friends. Richard was paranoid." Her denial was fierce, but Miss Marple pressed on, her tone gentle. "Paranoia or truth? The locket inscribed to my eternal love, M, was found near the shrine, not lost weeks ago, as you claimed. And Dr. Haydock's watch, engraved with CV, tells a story of its own." She glanced at Haydock, whose smile faltered, his hand slipping to his pocket. Haydock leaned forward, his voice smooth but strained. "Miss Marple, you're weaving a tale, but it's thin. The watch was a gift, the glove stolen. As for Clara, we spoke occasionally. Professional matters, nothing more." His words were measured, but Miss Marple saw the tension in his jaw, the flicker of fear in his eyes. She continued, her voice steady. "Professional, perhaps, but intimate too. The phone records show calls from your number to Clara's, late at night, over weeks. Richard suspected an affair, didn't he? He threatened to expose you, to ruin your reputation." Clara gasped, her locket falling to her lap. "That's not true. Richard and I were happy." But her eyes darted to Haydock, betraying her. Miss Marple turned to the scuff marks, her voice sharpening. The shrine was no random choice. Richard was killed away from the statue, dragged to its base to stage a ritualistic scene. The scuff marks prove it, as does the crimson fabric from Sylvia's gown, torn not in chaos, but deliberately placed. Sylvia's handkerchief fell, her face ashen. "My gown! But I tore it running after the scream." Miss Marple shook her head, her needles pausing. "No, Sylvia, it was found too far from the statue, near the hedge where the struggle began. Someone used it to mislead, just as they used the glove to point to Dr. Haydock. She turned to Haydock, her gaze piercing. You were at the shrine, Doctor. Your cigarette end confirms it. But you didn't act alone. Clara, your affair with Haydock was the spark. Richard's discovery of it drove him to confront you both. And you, Doctor, saw a chance to silence him. Haydock rose, his face pale, his charm crumbling. This is absurd. I was in the house with Langley, but Miss Marple's voice cut through, calm and relentless. Langley was drunk, your alibi weak. The glove, the watch, the calls, all led to you. And Clara's locket, inscribed by you, was dropped in haste, a lover's token turned evidence. She turned to Clara, whose tears now flowed freely. My dear, you didn't wield the dagger, but you knew. Your calls with Haydock, your silence about the locket, you protected him, out of love or fear. Clara sobbed, her voice breaking. I didn't know he'd kill him. Richard was angry, yes, he suspected, but I thought we could talk, explain. Her confession hung in the air, and Haydock's shoulders slumped, his defiance fading. Miss Marple continued, her tone almost sorrowful. You lured Richard to the shrine, Doctor, under pretense of a ritual discussion. You argued, struggled. The scuff marks tell that tale. Then you stabbed him, dragged him to the statue, and planted the fabric to confuse us. But murder, like gossip in my village, leaves traces. Mrs. Price gasped, her shawl slipping, while Sylvia clutched the arm of her chair. Tom, silent until now, shifted, his eyes wide with shock. Craddock, stepping forward, signalled his constable. Dr. Haydock, you're under arrest for the murder of Richard Fenwick. Haydock's face contorted, and he sank back, his voice low. It wasn't planned. He threatened to ruin me, to tell everyone. Clara was mine, not his. I lost control. His confession, raw and halting, sealed the case, and the constable led him away, his footsteps echoing in the silent room. Clara, weeping, rose to follow, but Miss Marple's gentle hand stopped her. Stay, my dear. You've a chance to make amends. Tell the truth, all of it. Clara nodded, her face crumpling, and confessed to the affair, insisting she hadn't known Haydock's intent. Sylvia, stunned, murmured, Richard, my poor boy, while Mrs. Price, for once speechless, stared at the fire. Craddock, notebook in hand, took Clara's statement, his expression grim but satisfied. As the room emptied, Miss Marple remained, her knitting resumed, her thoughts on the case's resolution. The shrine's mystique had been a smokescreen, as she'd suspected, hiding a crime of jealousy and desperation. Haydock's charm, Clara's mask, Sylvia's fear, all were human failings, not unlike those in St. Mary Mead, where a jilted lover's rage had once sparked a brawl. The locket, the watch, the scuff marks, each clue had been a stitch in the pattern, leading her to the truth. Craddock joined her, his face weary but grateful. You've done it again, Miss Marple. I'd have taken weeks to see through Haydock's lies. She smiled, her needles clicking. People are the same everywhere, Inspector. Love and hate, they leave marks if you know where to look. He chuckled, shaking his head. I'll stick to fingerprints. But I'm glad you were here. The veil had lifted, revealing the killer's face, but Miss Marple felt no triumph, only a quiet sorrow for the lives broken by passion. She tucked, her knitting away, her mind already turning to her return to St. Mary Mead, where simpler mysteries awaited, though none, she knew, would be as stark as the shadow cast by Astarte's stones. Chapter 9. The Aftermath. The seventh day at Fernley Hall unfolded with a quiet that felt almost sacred, as if the estate itself exhaled after the storm of Richard Fenwick's murder and its resolution. The sun, breaking through a veil of clouds, bathed the gardens in a golden light, softening the stark outline of the Astarte shrine. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the morning room with her knitting, watched the play of shadows through the window, her mind sifting through the case's final echoes. Dr. Maurice Haydick's confession, Clara Vane's tearful admission, and the lifting of the veil had brought clarity, yet the human cost lingered, a familiar weight from her St. Mary Mead days. Murder, she knew, left ripples, touching even those who stood on the shore. The house was subdued, its guests and staff moving with the tentative steps of those emerging from a nightmare. Inspector Craddock's investigation had concluded with Haydock in custody and Clara released after giving a full statement, her complicity limited to silence, not violence. Sylvia Fenwick, though shaken, had regained a measure of poise, determined to restore the estate's peace. Mrs. Lavinia Price, chastened by the drama, hovered on the edges of conversations, her gossip muted. Miss Marple, ever unobtrusive, felt the shift in the air, a return to normalcy that was both fragile and necessary. Breakfast was a simple affair, served in the dining room with its high ceilings and sombre portraits. Sylvia presided, her hands steady as she poured tea, a stark contrast to the trembling figure of days past. Clara was absent, having retreated to her room, her departure for London imminent. Mrs. Price, her scarf a subdued navy, spoke little, her eyes darting to Sylvia as if seeking forgiveness for her earlier relish of scandal. Miss Marple, nibbling a piece of toast, observed the dynamics, noting Sylvia's quiet resolve and the absence of Haydock's polished presence. The room felt lighter, yet the memory of Richard's death hung like a faint perfume, impossible to ignore. After breakfast, Sylvia sought out Miss Marple, finding her in the conservatory among the ferns and orchids. "Jane," she said, her voice soft, "I owe you more than I can say. You've given us back our home, our sanity." Her eyes, though tired, held gratitude, and Miss Marple smiled, setting her knitting aside. "My dear, I only followed the truth as it presented itself. You've a strong heart, Sylvia, to carry on after such sorrow." Sylvia's lips trembled, and she sank onto a wicker chair. "I must. For Richard, for Henry. But the shrine, I can't bear it any longer. I'm having it dismantled stone by stone." Miss Marple nodded, her expression thoughtful. "A wise choice. It's only stone after all, but it's cast too long a shadow." She recalled a St. Mary Mead garden, where a sundial, linked to a village feud, had been removed to quell bad blood. Here, the shrine's mystique had fueled fear and deception, and its removal would mark a new beginning. Sylvia hesitated, then added, "Clara's leaving today. She's broken, Jane. I don't know if she'll recover." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "She's young, and youth is resilient, but she'll carry this lesson as we all do." Their conversation was interrupted by Craddock, who entered with a brisk nod, his notebook tucked under his arm. "Miss Marple, Lady Fenwick," he greeted, I'm tying up loose ends before I head back to the station. Haydock's been charged, and Clara's statement checks out. She knew of the affair, but not the murder. We're closing the case." His voice held satisfaction, tempered by fatigue, and Miss Marple inclined her head. "You've done fine work, Inspector. But tell me, what of Richard's partner, this Merton? Did he play a role?" Craddock's brow furrowed, and he flipped open his notebook. "Merton's a slippery one, a promoter with a nose for profit. He admitted to backing Richard's shrine scheme, public rituals, ticketed events, that sort of thing. But he pulled out when Richard got erratic, demanding more control. Merton swears he was in London the night of the murder, and his alibi holds. Seems Richard's threats to expose him were empty, just frustration." He paused, eyeing Miss Marple. "You don't think we missed something, do you?" Miss Marple's needles resumed their gentle rhythm. "No, Inspector. I think you've caught the right man. Merton's a footnote, a spark that lit Richard's temper, but not the fire that killed him. Haydock's jealousy, Clara's silence, those were the flames." Craddock nodded, relieved, and excused himself to finalize his report, leaving Sylvia and Miss Marple in the conservatory's quiet. Sylvia's gaze drifted to a fern, its fronds drooping. I blamed the shrine, you know," she murmured. "All those stories of Astarte's wrath. I was foolish." Miss Marple patted her hand, her voice gentle. "Not foolish, only human. We seek explanations when pain overwhelms us. In my village, a widow once blamed a cursed well for her husband's fall until we found he'd been drunk. The truth is simpler and harder." Sylvia managed a faint smile, her resolve strengthening, and Miss Marple felt a quiet pride in her friend's resilience. Leaving Sylvia to her thoughts, Miss Marple sought out Mrs. Price, curious to gauge the widow's state after the case's resolution. She found her in the library, staring at a volume of poetry, her usual vivacity dimmed. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Price said, her voice subdued, "I've been a fool, haven't I? All my talk, stirring things up. I thought it was harmless." Her eyes were earnest, and Miss Marple settled beside her, her expression kind. "Gossip is a sharp tool, Mrs. Price, but it can cut both ways. Your words helped us, in the end. Clara's argument, Richard's loan. You saw what others missed." Mrs. Price's cheeks flushed, a mix of shame and gratitude. "I'll be quieter, I promise. No more tales." Miss Marple chuckled softly, recalling a St. Mary Mead gossip whose vows of silence lasted a week. "Just be careful, my dear. A little observation goes a long way, without embellishment." Mrs. Price nodded, her scarf slipping as she closed the book, and Miss Marple left her, suspecting the widow's reform would be temporary, but sincere for now. In the hall, Miss Marple encountered Clara, her suitcase packed, her face pale but composed. "Miss Marple," Clara said, her voice low, "I'm leaving for London. I wanted to thank you. You could have judged me, but you didn't." Her eyes, free of their earlier artifice, held a raw honesty, and Miss Marple smiled, her hand resting lightly on Clara's arm. "My dear, we all falter. You loved unwisely, but you didn't kill. Go and make a new start." Clara's lips trembled, and she nodded, her locket glinting as she turned away, her footsteps echoing on the marble floor. The afternoon saw Miss Marple preparing for her own departure, her train to St. Mary Mead scheduled for the evening. She packed her knitting, her thoughts on the case's aftermath. Haydock's arrest had closed the chapter, but Clara's shame, Sylvia's grief, and Mrs. Price's chastening were its epilogue, each a reminder of human frailty. She joined Craddock in the drawing room for a final conversation, finding him by the fireplace, his expression reflective. "Miss Marple," he said, "you've a gift, seeing through people like glass. I rely on evidence, but you read hearts." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, her needles clicking. "Hearts leave. Evidence too, Inspector. A glance, a pause, a lie. They're as clear as fingerprints if you know the pattern. In St. Mary Mead, I learned it early, watching neighbours squabble over a fence or a pie." Craddock laughed, shaking his head. "I'd hate to cross you in your village, but I'm grateful truly. This case would have dragged without you." She inclined her head, accepting the compliment with her usual modesty, though her mind was already on her cottage, her roses, and Cherry's inevitable questions about her adventure. Before leaving, Miss Marple took a final walk to the shrine, now stripped of its police tape, its stones silent under the sun. The statue of Astarte gazed impassively, its mystique diminished by the truth. She stood for a moment, her shawl drawn tight, reflecting on the passions that had converged here. Haydock's jealousy, Clara's betrayal, Richard's ambition. They were no different from the dramas of St. Mary Mead, where a stolen kiss or a cheated deal could spark chaos. The shrine, like her village's churchyard, was merely a backdrop, its power drawn from the hearts that met within it. Returning to the house, she found Sylvia waiting, a small parcel in her hands. "Jane, a token," Sylvia said, offering a silk scarf, its pattern delicate and floral. "For your kindness, your clarity." Miss Marple accepted it, touched, and promised to write. As she boarded the car to the station, her knitting bag at her side, she felt the case settle into memory, another thread in her tapestry of human folly. The train to St. Mary Mead chugged through the countryside, its rhythm soothing. Miss Marple, knitting a grey mitten, gazed at the passing fields, her thoughts on Fernley Hall. The shrine would soon be gone. Sylvia's courage would rebuild the estate, and Clara, perhaps, would find redemption. Mrs. Price might curb her tongue for a time, but the lesson of Astarte, love's power to destroy, would linger, as it had in every case she'd solved. She smiled faintly, her needle steady, ready for the next mystery, whether in her village or beyond, where human nature, unmasked, would always tell its tale.